A scream tore through the night in Talbot County, Maryland. One that never reached beyond the tobacco fields. One the stars heard, but no living soul dared to answer. It was August of 1829. Through the dark rows ran a pregnant woman named Sarah, barefoot, her hands pressed tight against her belly, as if to shield the little she had left in this world. Blood streaked down her legs. Her breath came in ragged, short bursts. Behind her, the dogs were closing in. She wasn't running from the plantation. She was running within it, trapped inside its borders like a moth in a jar. And the man who owned her, a farmer called Jacob Ridley, had given the order for the hunt. What Sarah had done to deserve this, no one would speak aloud. But everyone on the Ridley farm knew. She had refused him. Refused what he believed was his right to take. And in a place where the law saw her as property, that refusal cost her everything. They found her by the creek just before dawn. She was still breathing, but barely. Her child, a boy, was born there in the mud and reeds, pulled into the world by rough hands that cared nothing for his mother's pain. Jacob Ridley stood watching from a distance, arms crossed, his face as blank as stone. Sarah lived 3 more days, long enough to name her son, long enough to whisper something into his tiny ear that no one else could hear. Then she was gone. The boy's name was Thomas, and 18 years later, he would return to that same farm, not as a slave, but as something far more dangerous. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. Talbot County sat on the eastern edge of Maryland, where the Chesapeake Bay met endless fields of tobacco and corn. It was a place of old money and older cruelty. The soil was rich. The trees were tall, and the men who worked the land were black, broken, and invisible. In 1829, the county's population was nearly 15,000. More than half were enslaved. They worked the farms that made white men wealthy. They built the houses, cooked the food, raised the children, and disappeared into unmarked graves. When their bodies finally gave out, Jacob Ridley was among the wealthiest farmers in the county. He owned 200 acres, a manor house with white columns, and 43 human beings. His father had owned slaves, and his grandfather before him. It was tradition. It was business. It was, in his mind, the natural order. The Ridley estate lay 3 miles outside the town of Easton, along a dirt road lined with oaks. The main house stood 2 stories tall, painted white, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Behind it stood the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the barn, and a row of small cabins where the enslaved lived. Everything was neat, orderly, a picture of Southern prosperity built on suffering no one acknowledged. Sarah had been bought at auction in Baltimore when she was 16. She was quiet, strong, and beautiful in a way that made men stare too long. Jacob noticed her the first week she arrived. He watched her carry water, hoe weeds, tend the fire in the kitchen house, and when she turned 18, he decided she would be his. But Sarah possessed a will that wouldn't bend. She had a man she loved, a field hand named Elijah, and she'd made promises to him in the shadows where no white eyes could see. Elijah was tall and broad-shouldered, his hands scarred from years of labor. He'd been on the Ridley farm since he was a boy, and he and Sarah had found each other the way people do when the world tries to crush them. Quietly, carefully, with a hope that refused to die. When Jacob came to her cabin one night in the spring of 1828, Sarah told him no, not with words perhaps, but with her eyes, with the way she stood, with a silence that said, "You do not own all of me." He could have forced her. Many did. The law would have protected him. But Jacob Ridley prided himself on being a man of control, a gentleman. He didn't want to take. He wanted to be chosen. So instead, he punished her. He sold Elijah south to a cotton farm in Georgia, where men died before they turned 30. He moved Sarah to the fields farthest from the main house. He cut her food rations. He made sure she understood the cost of defiance. And when she became pregnant anyway, carrying Elijah's child, Jacob's rage turned cold and calculating. The night Sarah ran was the night everything broke. She'd been working in the fields all day, her belly swollen, her back aching. The overseer, a man named Calhoun, had been watching her with cruel eyes. He reported back to Jacob that evening, told him Sarah was slowing down, told him she was no longer useful. Jacob made a decision. He would sell her. Sell her and the child both once it was born. Send them deep south where they'd never be heard from again. But someone told Sarah. One of the kitchen women, a girl named Penny, overheard the conversation and ran to warn her. Sarah knew what being sold south meant. It meant never seeing these fields again, never being near the place where Elijah had lived, never holding even the slim hope that someday she might find him again. It meant her child would grow up in hell. So she ran. Not to escape. There was nowhere to go. The roads were patrolled. The woods were watched. Free states were hundreds of miles away, and she was 9 months pregnant. She ran because her body wouldn't let her stand still, because panic and grief and rage had to go somewhere. Jacob sent the dogs. He sent Calhoun and 2 other men. He stood on his porch and watched them disappear into the darkness, torches bobbing like evil stars. They found her by the creek at dawn, collapsed in the shallow water, her body shaking with contractions. Calhoun pulled her out by her hair, dragged her onto the bank. The baby came fast, too fast, slipping into the world with a weak cry that barely sounded human. Jacob arrived on horseback just as the sun broke over the horizon. He looked down at Sarah, at the blood, at the baby lying on the ground, and his face showed nothing. "Clean her up," he said, "and bring the child to the house." Sarah was carried back to her cabin by 2 women who wept as they washed her. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Something was broken inside her. Something the trauma of the chase and the birth had torn beyond repair. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips moving, whispering words no one could make out. The baby somehow survived. He was small and fragile, but he breathed. He cried. He wanted to live. Jacob had no intention of raising him. He planned to give the child to one of the nursing women and forget about him. But then Sarah did something that changed his mind. On her 3rd day, when she knew she was dying, she asked to see her son. The women brought him to her. She held him against her chest, her hands trembling, and she looked up at the ceiling with eyes that saw past it, past the roof, past the sky. "His name is Thomas," she whispered, "and he's going to be free." One of the women, old Esther, leaned close. "How you know that, child?" Sarah smiled faint and sad. "Because I dreamed it. I dreamed he'd grow tall, strong. I dreamed he'd walk out of here on his own 2 feet, and nobody could stop him." Esther glanced toward the door, afraid someone might hear. Sarah's voice dropped lower. "And I dreamed he'd come back. For me, for all of us." Then she closed her eyes, and an hour later, she stopped breathing. Thomas was born into a world that wanted him erased. His mother died before he could remember her face. The other women on the farm raised him, passing him from lap to lap, nursing him with what little they had. They told him his mother had been brave, that she had loved him, that her last words were a prayer he would survive. But they didn't tell him how she died. Not yet. Some truths are too heavy for a child to carry. Jacob Ridley never acknowledged Thomas as anything more than another body to work the fields. By the time the boy was 6, he was hauling water. By 8, he was picking worms off tobacco leaves in the burning sun. By 10, His hands were scarred and his back was strong. He learned early to stay quiet, to move fast, to make himself small when the overseer's whip was out. He learned which men could be trusted, and which would sell you out for an extra biscuit. He learned the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who could hurt you and those who couldn't stop it. The Ridley farm was not the worst place a slave could be, but it was far from kind. The work was endless. The food was thin. The cabins were cold in winter and stifling in summer. Sickness swept through every few years, taking the old and the young. Jacob Ridley was not a man who beat his workers for sport, but he was not a man who cared if they suffered either. To him, they were tools, and tools were meant to be used until they broke. Thomas grew up watching. He watched how Jacob walked, how he talked, how he looked at people like they were less than dogs. He watched the overseer, Calhoun, a mean drunk who liked to humiliate people just to pass the time. He watched the other slaves, how they bent and bowed and swallowed their rage just to survive another day. And he remembered. By the time Thomas was 10, he'd learned to read. A traveling preacher, a white man with kind eyes and a dangerous Bible, passed through the county twice a year. He held secret gatherings in the woods, teaching whoever would come. Most were too afraid. But Thomas went. He learned his letters. He learned numbers. He learned that words had power. The preacher's name was Reverend Cole, and he didn't believe in slavery. He never said it outright. But Thomas could tell. The way he looked at them, the way he touched their shoulders and called them brother and sister, the way he read certain passages from Scripture, the ones about freedom and justice and the Lord breaking chains. "You're a smart boy," Reverend Cole said to Thomas one evening after the others had gone. "You remember things. You understand." "Yes, sir," Thomas said quietly. "Don't let them kill that," the Reverend said. "Don't let this place make you forget you're human." Thomas nodded, but inside, something harder was forming, something that wasn't just about being human. It was about being owed. When Thomas was 12, old Esther pulled him aside one evening after the work bell rang. She was ancient, bent like a question mark, with eyes that had seen more than most could bear. She'd been on the Ridley farm for 40 years, brought over from Virginia as a girl. She'd buried 3 husbands, 5 children, and more friends than she could count. "Come walk with me," she said. They walked to the edge of the property, where the fields met a line of trees. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and orange. Esther moved slow, her cane tapping the dirt. "You old enough now," she said finally. "Old enough to know the truth." Thomas waited. "Your mama didn't just die," Esther said. "She was killed, not with a knife or a bullet, but with cruelty, with hate. With a man who thought he could do anything he wanted just because the law said he could." She pointed one crooked finger toward the manor house on the hill, its windows glowing gold in the dusk. "That man up there, Jacob Ridley, he's the reason your mama's gone." Thomas felt something cold slide down his spine. He'd always known his mother died young, but he'd never known why. "What did he do?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Esther told him everything. About Elijah, about Sarah's refusal, about the sale, about the chase through the fields, about the birth by the creek, about the 3 days Sarah spent dying while Jacob Ridley did nothing. When she finished, Thomas stood there in silence, staring at the manor house. His hands were clenched into fists. "She told me something before she passed," Esther said quietly. "Said if you lived, you'd be the one to settle it. Said you had her fire." "What did she want me to do?" Thomas asked. Esther shook her head. "She didn't say, but you'll know when the time comes." Thomas looked at her, his young face hard. "I'll know," he said, and he walked back toward the cabins, his mind already turning. The years that followed were slow and brutal. Thomas grew taller, stronger, sharper. He worked the fields without complaint. He kept his head down. He learned to hide what he was thinking behind a blank face and quiet words. But inside he was building something. He learned the rhythms of the farm. Who went where, when Jacob was alone, when Calhoun drank too much and passed out in the barn. He learned the roads, the landmarks, the distances. He listened to the older men talk about escapes that failed and the few that succeeded. He studied maps when Reverend Cole brought them, memorizing the shape of Maryland, the location of Pennsylvania, the route north. By the time he was 15, Thomas knew he would leave. It was only a question of when. But he also knew that leaving wouldn't be enough, because every night he dreamed of his mother. He saw her running, saw the dogs, saw the blood, saw Jacob Ridley standing there watching, doing nothing, and every morning he woke with the same thought. This has to be answered. In 1846, when Thomas was 17, Maryland was changing. The tobacco economy was collapsing. Soil exhaustion and falling prices were crushing farmers across the state. Some were freeing their slaves, not out of mercy, but because it was cheaper to hire free labor than to feed and house people year-round. Jacob Ridley, now in his early 60s, was feeling the pressure. His debts were mounting. His land was producing less. His workers were aging, dying, becoming less profitable. Rumors spread through the slave quarters that Ridley was planning to sell people south. Names were whispered. Families braced for separation. Thomas heard his own name twice, passed from mouth to mouth in the dark. He made a decision. He would leave, but he would come back. He spent weeks preparing. He stole small amounts of food, hiding them in a hollow tree near the property line. He made a rough map on a piece of cloth, marking the roads, the rivers, the towns he'd need to avoid. He talked to an old man named Moses, who'd tried to run 20 years earlier and been caught. Moses told him what mistakes to avoid, where the patrols were thickest, how to move without being seen. And then one night in late September 1847, Thomas walked off the Ridley farm. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He just walked, steady and sure, down the road that led north. He carried nothing but a knife, a piece of bread, and the name of a contact in Pennsylvania, a Quaker woman named Abigail Turner, who helped runaways. Reverend Cole had given him the name years ago, whispering it during one of their lessons, making Thomas repeat it until he had it memorized. It took him 11 days to reach Philadelphia. He traveled at night, slept in barns and under bridges, avoided roads when he could. The journey was harder than he'd imagined. His feet blistered, his stomach cramped with hunger. Twice he was nearly caught. The first time, he was crossing through a small town in Delaware when a patrol rode past. Thomas ducked into an alley, pressing himself against the wall, holding his breath as the horses clattered by. One of the men was laughing about something. The other was complaining about the cold. Neither looked his way. The second time was worse. He was walking along a creek, trying to stay off the main road, when a farmer's dog started barking. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and vicious. Thomas ran, splashing through the shallow water, his boots filling with mud. Behind him, he heard voices, men shouting. He didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook. Then he hid in a thicket of thorns, bleeding and shaking, until the sun came up and the voices faded. But he made it. Philadelphia was bigger than anything Thomas had ever imagined. Buildings pressed together like books on a shelf, streets crowded with people, carts, horses. The noise was overwhelming. The smell of coal smoke and garbage and food mixed together in a way that made his head spin. He found his way to the address Reverend Cole had given him, a narrow house on a quiet street. He knocked 3 times, the signal he'd been told to use. A white woman in her 50s opened the door. She looked him up and down, her face unreadable. "Abigail Turner?" Thomas asked quietly. She nodded. "Come in quickly." Inside, she gave him food, water, a place to wash. She asked no questions. Just told him he could stay 2 days, no more. After that, he'd need to find work, find a place to live, find a way to survive. "This is a free state," she said, "but it's not safe. There are slave catchers here, bounty hunters, people who will turn you in for $1. You understand?"
"Yes, ma'am,"
Thomas said. "Good." She handed him a piece of paper. "This is a list of places that might hire you. Stables, docks, warehouses. Don't tell anyone where you're from. Don't trust anyone too quickly. And if someone asks your name, you say Thomas Freeman. That's your name now." Thomas looked at the paper, at the words written in careful script. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Don't thank me. Just survive." Thomas found work at a stable owned by a free black man named Samuel Wright. Samuel was in his 40s, strong and quiet, with a scar running down the left side of his face. He didn't ask where Thomas came from. He just looked at his hands, saw the calluses, and hired him on the spot. The work was hard but honest. Thomas mucked stalls, fed horses, repaired harnesses. He slept in a small room above the stable, sharing it with 2 other men. He saved every penny he earned, keeping his money hidden in a tin box under the floorboards. Philadelphia was full of people like him. Runaways, freed men, people who'd bought their way out of bondage or been born free. They moved carefully, always watching, always aware that freedom was fragile. Thomas learned to walk like a free man. Head up, shoulders back, eyes forward. He learned to meet a white man's gaze without flinching, without showing fear. He bought a coat, a pair of boots, a hat. He learned to speak differently, to lose the rhythms of the plantation, to sound like someone who'd never been owned. But at night, alone in his room, he thought about Talbot County, about the Ridley farm, about his mother's grave unmarked somewhere in those fields. And he began to plan. Freedom was not enough. Freedom was a door left open, but it didn't close the wounds. At night, Thomas dreamed of his mother. He saw her running through the tobacco fields, her belly swollen, her feet bleeding, saw the dogs closing in, saw the terror in her eyes. He woke with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, the sheets soaked with sweat. During the day he worked. He moved through Philadelphia like a man with purpose. But inside something was burning. A question that wouldn't leave him alone. What does justice look like when the law was never on your side? He asked around carefully about men who'd gone back south, men who'd returned to the places they escaped from. Most people thought it was suicide. A few understood it was something else, something necessary. Thomas met a man named Benjamin one cold evening in December of 1847. Benjamin was sitting outside a boarding house, smoking a pipe, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and had a scar across his throat that looked like someone had tried to kill him and failed. "You're new here," Benjamin said, not looking at Thomas. "Few months now." Thomas replied. "Where are you from?" Thomas hesitated, then said, "Maryland, Eastern Shore." Benjamin nodded slowly. "Tobacco country?"
"Yes."
"And you ran?"
"Yes."
Benjamin took another pull from his pipe. "You thinking about going back?" Thomas felt his heart skip. "What makes you say that?" "I can see it in your eyes." Benjamin said, "Same look I had. Same look a lot of us get when we realize that being free ain't the same as being settled." Thomas sat down on the steps next to him. "You went back." I did. Benjamin held up his damaged hand. Lost these fingers for it. Nearly lost my life. But I did what I needed to do. What did you need to do? Benjamin was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard. The man who owned me was named Crawford. He was a tobacco farmer, too, down in Virginia. He liked to hurt people. Not because they did anything wrong, just because he could. He broke my sister's arm when she was 10 because she dropped a plate. He sold my mother when I was 12. And when I turned 16, he did something to me I won't speak about, something that left this scar. Benjamin touched his throat. I ran that same year, made it to Pennsylvania, got work, got free, and I tried to forget, tried to build a new life. But every night I saw his face, heard his voice, felt his hands on me. So you went back? Thomas said. I went back. Benjamin confirmed. Took me 3 years to work up the courage, but I did it. Went back to that farm. Found him alone in his barn one evening, and I settled my account. Thomas leaned forward. Did you kill him? Benjamin looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. What I did or didn't do ain't important. What matters is I stopped carrying him around inside me. I stopped letting him own the part of my mind that was supposed to be free. He knocked the ash from his pipe. But I'll tell you this, brother. Going back nearly destroyed me. Not because of what I did to him, but because of what it cost me. I can't ever go back to Virginia again. Can't see the land where my mom is buried. Can't visit the few people I loved who are still there. I traded one kind of freedom for another. Thomas absorbed this. Do you regret it? No, Benjamin said immediately. But you need to know what you're trading before you make the deal. Thomas thought about Benjamin's words for weeks. He worked at the stable. He saved his money. He kept his head down. But the question kept circling back. What would settling his account look like? He couldn't just kill Jacob Ridley. Murder would bring the law down on him. And worse, it would be too quick, too clean. Jacob Ridley had taken everything from Sarah slowly, piece by piece, with systematic cruelty. He'd taken her love, her dignity, her hope, her life. And he'd done it all while the law protected him. Thomas began to understand something. The worst punishment for a man like Jacob Ridley wasn't death. It was losing everything that made him powerful. It was being stripped down to nothing, the way he'd stripped others. It was experiencing powerlessness, humiliation, abandonment. It was feeling what Sarah felt. Thomas started gathering information. He talked to people who traveled through Maryland. He read newspapers at the public library, scanning for mentions of Talbot County. He learned that the tobacco economy was collapsing faster than anyone expected. Farms were failing. Banks were foreclosing. Men who'd been wealthy for generations were suddenly broke. And Jacob Ridley's name appeared in the papers. A notice of debt, a foreclosure warning, a sale of property. The man was vulnerable. Thomas realized this was his moment. Not to strike with violence, but with strategy, with patience, with the kind of slow, methodical destruction that would leave Ridley alive, but broken. In the spring of 1848, after saving for 6 months, Thomas had enough money to travel. He bought forged freedom papers from a man who specialized in such things. Documents claiming he was Thomas Freeman, a freedman from Delaware, born free in 1829. The papers cost him nearly everything he'd saved, but they were good, professional. They would pass inspection. He told Samuel Wright he was leaving. Samuel looked at him for a long time. You're going back, aren't you? Thomas didn't answer. Be careful, Samuel said. Whatever you're planning, be careful. The world is changing, but not fast enough. They'll still hang a black man for looking at a white man wrong. I know, Thomas said. Samuel nodded. Then go do what you need to do, but come back alive. Thomas returned to Talbot County in May of 1848. He didn't sneak in. He didn't hide. He came back as a free man, riding on a wagon with a traveling merchant heading to Easton. He wore decent clothes, carried his papers in his pocket, walked with the confidence of someone who belonged. The county looked the same roads, the same trees, the same fields stretching toward the horizon. But Thomas was different. He'd left as property. He was coming back as a person. He took a room at a boarding house in Easton, a place that catered to free blacks and poor whites. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Hastings, looked at his papers and asked no questions. He paid for a week in advance. The first thing Thomas did was observe. He walked through the town, listening to conversations, reading notices posted outside the courthouse, visiting the general store where people gathered to gossip. He learned quickly that Jacob Ridley was in trouble, deep trouble. The farm was failing. Ridley had lost half his land to the bank. His workers, most of them, had been sold off or had run away. The ones who remained were old or sick, barely able to maintain the property. Ridley himself was drinking heavily, rarely seen in town, his reputation sliding from respected landowner to pathetic drunk. Thomas felt no pity, only satisfaction. The collapse had already begun. He just needed to accelerate it. He got a job at a neighboring farm owned by a man named Whitmore. Whitmore was looking for experienced hands, and Thomas's knowledge of tobacco farming made him valuable. He worked hard, kept quiet, and watched the Ridley property from a distance. The manor house looked different now. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged. Weeds grew tall around the foundation. It was a house dying from neglect, and Jacob Ridley was inside letting it happen. Thomas began his campaign carefully. He started by talking to the remaining workers on the Ridley farm. There were only 7 left. He'd meet them at the creek on Sunday mornings, the one day they had a few hours of rest. He'd bring food, tobacco, sometimes a bit of money. He'd listen to their complaints, their fears, their exhaustion. And then he'd tell them about Philadelphia, about other cities, about places where a black person could work for wages, live without fear, make choices. He didn't tell them to run. He just planted seeds. Within a month, 3 of them left. Just walked off the property and disappeared. Ridley couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't afford slave catchers, couldn't afford to replace them. He was stuck. Thomas moved to the next phase. He visited every creditor Jacob Ridley owed money to. There were many. The general store, the blacksmith, the feed supplier, men who'd extended credit for years, assuming Ridley would eventually pay. Thomas introduced himself as an investor from Delaware, interested in buying distressed debts at a discount. Most of them laughed at first, but when Thomas offered cash, real money, they stopped laughing. He bought Ridley's debts for pennies on the dollar. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He used money he'd saved, money he borrowed from Samuel Wright, money he earned working for Whitmore. By July, Thomas owned more than half of Jacob Ridley's outstanding debts, and he began calling them in, politely, professionally, through letters delivered by the county clerk. Ridley ignored the first few letters, but when the sheriff showed up with a court summons, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Thomas never appeared in court himself. He hired a lawyer, a young white man named Harrison, who had a reputation for being ruthless. Harrison filed motions, demanded payment, requested liens on Ridley's property. The legal system that had once protected Ridley now turned on him. The remaining workers left. All of them. In 1 week, the Ridley farm was empty except for Jacob himself. No one to plant, no one to harvest, no one to cook or clean or maintain the buildings. Ridley tried to hire free workers, but word had spread. Thomas had made sure of it. He'd visited every laborer in the county, offering better wages to work elsewhere, warning them that Ridley couldn't pay, suggesting that any man who worked for him would be working for free. The crops rotted in the fields. The barn roof caved in during a summer storm. The fences fell apart. The farm collapsed in on itself like a body giving up. Thomas watched it all from a distance. Patient and methodical, he varied his routine, worked different jobs, moved between farms, never stayed in one place long enough to draw attention. He was a ghost, present, but invisible. In August, the bank foreclosed on the remaining Ridley land. Everything except the manor house and 5 acres around it. Even that would be taken soon. The auction notice appeared in the newspaper. People who'd known Jacob Ridley for decades came to bid on his property, picking over the bones of his empire like vultures. Thomas attended the auction. He stood in the back, his hat pulled low, and watched men buy pieces of his mother's suffering. The fields where she'd worked, the barn where she'd been whipped once for talking back, the creek where she'd given birth to him. He bought nothing. He didn't need to. The point wasn't to own the land. The point was to watch Jacob Ridley lose it. After the auction, Thomas heard through the grapevine that Ridley had tried to borrow money from former friends. All of them refused, some out of judgment, some out of fear that Ridley would never repay them, some simply because they didn't care. Thomas also heard that Ridley was asking questions, trying to figure out who was behind his collapse, who'd bought his debts, who'd turned his workers against him. But the trail went cold every time. Thomas had been careful, used different names, worked through intermediaries, left no clear connection. By September, Jacob Ridley had been evicted from his own home. The bank took the manor house. Ridley was forced to move into a one-room shack on the edge of Easton, a structure barely fit for animals. It had a dirt floor, no windows, a roof that leaked. It was the kind of place he used to house his slaves. Thomas learned where Ridley was living through Mrs. Hastings, who heard about it from a woman at church. He waited a week. Let Ridley settle into his new reality. Let him understand that this was his life now. And then, one cold evening in late September, Thomas walked to the shack. The structure sat at the end of a muddy lane, surrounded by weeds and garbage. A thin stream of smoke rose from a crooked chimney. The door was warped and didn't fit the frame properly. Thomas stood outside for a moment, listening. He could hear movement inside, the scrape of a chair, a cough, the clink of a bottle. He knocked once. The door opened. Jacob Ridley stood there, and Thomas barely recognized him. The man had aged 20 years in one. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and red. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been solid. His hands shook. Ridley squinted at Thomas. "Who are you?" "Someone you should remember," Thomas said quietly. Ridley frowned, leaning forward, trying to focus, and then slowly recognition crawled across his face like a spider. "No," he whispered. "You can't be?" "Yes," Thomas said. "I can." Ridley tried to close the door, but Thomas put his hand against it, holding it open. Not forcing, just preventing. "We need to talk," Thomas said. "I don't have to talk to you," Ridley said, his voice shaking. "I have no right." "Right." Thomas stepped closer. "Let's talk about rights. Did my mother have the right to say no to you? Did she have the right to keep the man she loved? Did she have the right to live?" Ridley's face went pale. He stumbled backward into the shack. Thomas followed him inside. The room was worse than Thomas expected. A broken cot in one corner. A table with one leg shorter than the others. A fireplace barely producing heat. The smell of mildew and despair hung in the air. Ridley collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "What do you want?" he said, his voice muffled. "You want money. I don't have any. You want an apology. Fine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. Now, leave me alone." Thomas looked around the room, at the broken man, at the empty life, at the cold and the filth. "I don't want your apology," Thomas said. "I want you to understand." "Understand what?" "That what you did to my mother, what you did to all of us, it didn't just disappear. It doesn't fade. It comes back. Maybe not the way you expect. Maybe not the way you can fight, but it comes back." Ridley looked up, his eyes wet. "I was a different man then. I was young. I didn't—" "You were the same man," Thomas interrupted. "You just had more power. And now you don't. Now you're living in a shack that's worse than the cabins you kept us in. Now you're alone and broke and hated. Now you know what it feels like to have nothing, to be nothing." He crouched down so he was eye level with Ridley. "My mother died because of you. She died scared and in pain and alone. And for 18 years I carried that. I carried her death like a weight on my back, but I'm not carrying it anymore." "What did you do?" Ridley whispered. "How did you?" "I took everything from you the same way you took everything from her," Thomas said. "Slowly, piece by piece. I made sure you felt it. Made sure you understood what it means to lose everything that matters." Ridley's hands were shaking violently now. "I'll tell people. I'll tell them what you did." Thomas smiled, cold and sad. "Tell them what?" "That a free black man bought your debts legally. That your workers left because you couldn't pay them. That your farm failed because you were a drunk and a bad businessman. Who's going to believe you? Who's going to care?" He stood up. "You're going to live, Jacob Ridley. You're going to wake up every morning in this shack and remember what you had. You're going to spend every day knowing why you lost it. And you're going to die alone with no one to mourn you. That's your punishment, not death. Life." Thomas walked to the door. Ridley called after him, his voice breaking. "Wait, please. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to?" Thomas stopped, his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "You live," he said. "You live every day knowing what you did. Knowing that somewhere out there, my mother's son is free. And you never will be." He walked out into the night, leaving Jacob Ridley alone in the dark. Thomas left Talbot County the next morning. He rode out on a wagon heading north, his forged papers in his pocket, his face calm. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing anymore. He returned to Philadelphia and found that Samuel Wright had held his job. Thomas worked at the stable for another year, saving money, rebuilding what he'd spent. He was quieter now, more settled. The fire that had burned in him for so long had cooled into something else. Not gone, just transformed. In 1850, Thomas moved west to Ohio. The Fugitive Slave Act had passed, making even free states dangerous for runaways. But Ohio had strong abolitionist communities, places where a black man could build a life with less fear. He settled in a town called Oberlin, known for its integrated college and progressive attitudes. He found work as a carpenter. He was good with his hands, patient and precise. He built furniture, repaired houses, crafted cabinets that people admired. He met a woman named Grace in the spring of 1851. She was a teacher at a school for black children, a woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. She'd been born free in Pennsylvania, the daughter of freed slaves who'd bought their own liberty years before. They talked for months before Thomas told her where he came from, what he'd been, what he'd done. Grace listened without judgment, her hand in his. "You did what you had to do," she said. "You survived, And you made sure he understood that actions have consequences. There's no sin in that. They married in the fall of 1852, had their first child, a daughter, in 1853, then a son in 1855, then another daughter in 1857. Thomas built them a house with his own hands, a modest place but solid, with a garden where Grace grew vegetables and flowers. He never told his children the full story. They knew he'd been enslaved. They knew he'd escaped, but they didn't know about Jacob Ridley. Didn't know about the revenge that had consumed their father for years. Thomas wanted them to grow up without that weight, without that darkness. But he kept a small piece of cloth in a wooden box under his bed. It had belonged to his mother, saved by one of the women from the Ridley farm, who'd escaped north years later and found Thomas in Philadelphia. She'd carried it for 2 decades, waiting for the chance to give it to him. The cloth was faded and worn, but Thomas held it sometimes at night when the house was quiet and his family was asleep. "I settled it, Mama," he would whisper. "I settled it. You can rest now." Jacob Ridley lived another 4 years after Thomas left. He survived on charity, small jobs, when he was sober enough to work, and the pity of people who remembered what he used to be. But that pity was thin and faded quickly. He tried several times to rebuild, tried to borrow money, tried to convince former associates to give him another chance, but no one trusted him. No one believed in him. He was a broken man in a broken body, haunted by ghosts he couldn't name. In the winter of 1852, Ridley was found dead in his shack. The cold had gotten in through the gaps in the walls. He'd been drinking as usual and passed out near the fireplace. The fire had gone out. He'd frozen slowly through the night. A neighbor found him 3 days later after noticing that no smoke had risen from the chimney. The sheriff came, made a brief report. Ridley's body was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the town's cemetery, in the section reserved for paupers and criminals. No one attended the burial except the gravedigger and a priest who said a quick prayer out of obligation. The county records listed his death with one line, "Jacob Ridley, farmer, deceased January 1852. And that was all. The Ridley farm was eventually bought by a family from Pennsylvania. They tore down the old manor house and built something new. The fields were replanted. The cabins where the enslaved had lived were burned. Within a decade, there was almost no physical trace that the Ridley plantation had ever existed. But Thomas remembered. And the descendants of those who'd suffered there remembered. And that memory passed down through generations, became a different kind of monument, one that couldn't be torn down or burned away. Some debts can never be repaid, some wounds never heal, but sometimes the children of the broken rise up and demand an accounting. Not with violence alone, not with mercy, but with the slow, relentless weight of justice that bends the world back toward balance. Sarah's scream in the tobacco fields did not go unanswered. It just took 18 years for the answer to arrive. And when it did, it didn't sound like rage. It sounded like footsteps, steady, patient, inevitable. The footsteps of a son who remembered, who survived, who came back, not to destroy a man's body, but to dismantle his world piece by piece until all that remained was the truth. Thomas Freeman lived until 1903, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74. His children and grandchildren surrounded his bed. Grace held his hand, and in his final moments he smiled, as if seeing something beautiful that no one else could see. Perhaps he saw his mother. Perhaps he saw freedom, real and complete. Perhaps he saw justice, finally done. His family buried him in a cemetery in Oberlin, under a stone that read, "Thomas Freeman, born enslaved, died free, 1829 to 1903. They never added what he'd done. Never spoke publicly about Jacob Ridley or Talbot County or the revenge that had consumed years of his life. But they knew, and they understood, and they taught their own children that some battles are worth fighting even when the world says you have no right to fight them. Because the right to seek justice, the right to demand accountability, the right to make sure that cruelty does not go unanswered, those rights don't come from laws or governments. They come from being human, from being someone's child, from carrying the memory of those who were destroyed and refusing to let that destruction be the end of the story. Sarah's story didn't end in the mud by the creek. It ended decades later in the quiet dignity of her son's life, in the family he built, in the freedom he claimed, in the justice he created when none was offered. And that, perhaps, is the real victory, not in Jacob Ridley's suffering, but in Thomas Freeman's survival. In the fact that a boy, born into hell, walked out of it on his own terms, and built something beautiful on the other side. The fields of Talbot County still grow tobacco and corn. The Chesapeake Bay still meets the land where it always has. But somewhere in those fields, beneath the soil and the roots and the passing of time, Sarah's spirit finally rests. Because her son kept his promise. He grew tall. He grew strong. He walked out on his own 2 feet. And nobody could stop him.